All right, welcome back. So we are in the last part of today's Nostradamus session here at the Marché du Film in the next program. And the Nostradamus project is a project commissioned by the Nordic film market of the Göteborg Film Festival to look into the near future, 3 to 5 years ahead. What we do is, of course, we follow the industry debates and all the public surveys that are available, and we talk to a lot of people in strategic positions and do some in-depth interviews with them to think about what their concerns and what their visions for the close future are. This year, the headline of our annual report, which is released in January, was "A Creative Explosion." And of course, some things have happened since then. Of course, there has been a production implosion as well. But in this time until 12 noon, I'm going to reconnect to some of the main topics and thoughts from this report and look at how they apply in the light of the corona crisis. I should mention that, of course, we are publicly funded. We wouldn't be able to do any of this work without all of these institutions. And our new main partner is Filminvest, and we are so thankful for their support. This year's interviews for the report come from the UK, France, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Brazil. They represent broadcasters, production, exhibition, VOD, streaming and aggregation, sales, public film funding, and industry analysis. And of course, again, we owe an enormous thank you to them as well. I should say that all of these names, all of these people, if they are directly quoted in the report, that is their opinion. If I am making outrageous claims, as well I might, because that is my style, you shouldn't hold any of these individuals accountable. The chapter topics, every year we look at slightly different things because of the horizon of the report. It enables us, the 3 to 5 year perspective enables us to look at different things every year, and the last 2 or 3 reports should still be relatively up to date, and in fact they are. And this year's topics included moving forward with diversity, the landscape after the streaming expansion has recontracted, as we expected it to do, but not quite yet, the creative renaissance of feature film and how that might play out in a polarizing theatrical marketplace, the window system, as always. It feels like we have spoken about that continuously since we started this work. We talked about some of the challenges that stemmed from the explosion in demand, and as well as some possible solutions. And looking back at these topics from today's position, I would say that the boom year problems are largely solved. At least they're not currently our problems, but everything else still stands. The final chapter of the report was on the changing conceptual landscape around video in general, and how especially the lives of the younger audience, the 25 and down, they have very different relationships to the moving image than even millennials. And I'm going to touch on some of those themes today, as well as some longer-term trends from the last 2 reports in the context of some pandemic-induced perspectives. To become a cinephile, you need films to blow your mind. I am 42 years old, and quite a lot of you are likely to be about the same age. And that tells me something about how you became who you are, and why you are at the Marché right now listening to this talk in a professional capacity. It starts with something private and personal, right? Whether your life was changed by Richard Linklater's Slacker, by Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, by a Spike Lee joint, by Wayne Wang, Paul Thomas Anderson, Larry Clark, or Alison Anders, by Lars von Trier and the Dogma 95 movement, by Gus Van Sant or Kevin Smith, by the Brazilian film revival, by Jeunet and Caro, by Trainspotting, by Lola Rent, by the international careers of Kieslowski and Kaurismäki. When I was a teenager, cinema was necessary for life. It attracted young people to a lifelong investment in the medium and into its possibilities, and also practically into this industry. And that is one backstory to the landscape we are in today. And I think we can, by the way, also agree that the next generation have not made that journey into feature film as passionately as ours. But it's not the only backstory to where we are today. It is today, or this year, also 30 years since this moment. This moment created the industry we are in today, and it happened, believe it or not, on American network television. In retrospect, all the elements of today's long-form drama are already present in Twin Peaks. An art house auteur given space for an uncompromising vision and time to explore a continuous arc. Storytelling centered on a community with a big cast, a distinct visual style, a refusal to tell a straightforward story, and genre elements spawning a global obsession that made Stranger Things look like nothing. And a weird thing happened. So usually in cinema, if you look back at the history of this form, we usually get an artistic revolution about every 20 years. But this time, I feel like it's been late. There are many reasons for that. The financial crisis of 2001 and 2008, the decline of the DVD market, creating a sort of jumpy funding landscape with too little space for artistic risk-taking, and this made theatrical, on average, quite predictable. It felt less relevant, it lost touch with people's real-world concerns. And as the numbers have shown, so this is not a matter of opinion, this is well documented, feature film in the last decades has been a hostile environment for people who are not white men. As the creativity in filmmaking constricted, much of the strongest talent, and I think particularly of the writers, ended up in television instead. People never stopped going to the movies, but for a while there, people stopped caring passionately about the movies, and they reserved their passion instead for a medium that treated the viewer's intelligence with respect. Intellectually, we all understand that TV and feature film are the same industry today. But if, like me, you have a film education of any kind, or you've just like internalized the values of our industry, we have been taught to think that the development of the form is one single narrative from the Lumière brothers onwards, and to think of it as a story of filmmakers. We think about film as a story about filmmakers, not about a story about audiences, not as a story about audiences. And it is a story about audiences, of course. And in that story, in their story, the living room screen was incredibly important. In our version of the story, the living room screen, from the moment it appeared, was a threat. Arguably, it's been the television has been the widest platform for the distribution of feature film for half a century, and certainly after home entertainment came in on top of it. So from the perspective of the audience, from where they were sitting, the different forms were always neighbors. You know, they lived in that same box. The TV drama boom of the last 30 years, and in particularly the streamers, have changed filmmaking in a few really important ways. They've given, you know, a fair chunk of very talented creators just a bag of money and allow them to do their thing. They have trained the viewers in following very complex, very dense stories. They have normalized reading subtitles. They have raised the status of the scriptwriting profession, and they have experimented with different ways of premiering film. And I would argue that all of these 5 things contributed and were necessary for Parasite being able to win Best Picture at the Oscars, what now seems a lifetime ago. So from the midst of a global pandemic, with a looming recession, this is all hard to remember, but at the start of this year, something had happened. Arthouse film is back, and arthouse film was connected to younger audiences and to broader audiences in a way it hadn't for quite some time. In the report, Bérénice Vincent talks about what she calls elevated art house, films that are aesthetically specific, with the strong driving narrative, but that are by today's standards short, that is to say they are feature length, but they are also deep. Every word, every visual element, every shot matters. And they are often visceral, which is a word that means that you can feel them inside your body as you are watching. The art house revolution of the 90s was very much about relevance. It was about who was portrayed and about who got to tell stories. It was not very cinematic. There were a lot of talking heads, and talking heads no longer do all that well in the cinema. But the baseline need for a story is still the same. Christian Rank, who's head of drama at the Danish public broadcaster DR, said it very well in a panel here in Gothenburg. I asked if he, as a commissioner, would give the industry one piece of advice. He said, "Tell me something true. Tell me something I don't know." The stories we yearn for are true and unfamiliar. In other words, they're specific, they're meaningful, and then if you're not just, that's true for all stories, but if you're not just telling a story in general, but you want it to be in the theaters, then the image must be complex, vivid, well composed, and the storytelling must be visceral. And that immersive physicality of holding your breath or jumping in your seat or laughing or crying, that is theatrical. And that does not correlate to the size of your budget. That is just as true for an art house film as it is for a Marvel movie. Audiences are way ahead of us on the principles of what kind of content they want to see where. And those principles are relatively systematic, and they don't let us dictate those to them. And we haven't actually been very great at figuring out what these principles are as they emerge. So for some people, The Irishman, which also feels now like it was made in another century, The Irishman was for some people an immersive theatrical experience. And they don't care if Netflix made it because their relationship is to Scorsese, and that relationship has always happened in the cinema. Other people very sensibly say that there's no way they will watch a film that long in a theater in one sitting, like this helpful man on the internet who wrote a guide for how to split The Irishman into a miniseries if you prefer to watch it like that instead. And this is vital because the formats as we know them are challenged on all fronts. Younger viewers have no format loyalty. They have no sense of format history either. And to them, you know, a lot of these distinctions that to us seem obvious because it's always been like that are completely arbitrary. But I think it behooves us to remember that the formats have changed for us as well. And us being older generations, people who are older than 25. We used to have a format called a TV movie, which you may remember. And I'm asking you now, like, what is that even? Is The Irishman a TV movie, for instance? If we break down all the moving images that younger demographic watch, including millennials now, so up to about 40 years old, we will find out that not just the distinctions between film and TV are irrelevant to them, but also that quite a lot of this viewing is happening on platforms and in formats that are very diverse and very far away from our core business. Computer gaming has for decades, of course, been a larger industry than ours, both in time invested and in the financial impact and the size of revenue. And of course, by now, gamers are in every generation. Normally, I wouldn't need to tell you this, but bizarrely, gamers don't seem to be so common among film industry professionals, so I always have to spell this out. Gamers are in every generation. If I showed this image to any other kind of room, many people in the space would recognize it. It's from Red Dead Redemption, a game which has in these last months consumed my husband, my brother, and many other of my middle-aged friends, male and female. And they have spent 50, 60 hours per person watching this or engaging in this world. VR, AR, and XR storytelling, of course, is normalizing, as we are seeing also here at the Marché. Even the adult animated drama boom, in some ways, reflects a conceptual refiguring of the meaning of realism in the filmed image. And also, when we're talking about realness, as in can we trust the picture that we are seeing that looks like it captures reality, this is being directly challenged by, for instance, deep fakes, by filmmaking in game engines, by AR. At the start of the year, in a lecture like this in Berlin, I mentioned that there is literally nothing now technically stopping us from making interactive films that have branching narratives, like Bandersnatch on Netflix, that are controlled through biofeedback by our emotional reactions as we watch. So what you feel in your body will guide how the story progresses. I will tell you, in February, this got a bit of a laugh in the room, but this week on the Marché program, a film exactly like that is being presented. the point here isn't that I'm right. The point is that the technology has been out there for some years now, and this was an inevitable experiment to happen, and that we really do need to follow these developments as they occur. That example is extreme, but in fact quite a lot of the audiovisual storytelling that is neither film nor TV drama is interactive. It's either interactive in its format, like video games, or in its distribution context. So these images are from an Instagram drama, many years old now, by a Finnish public broadcaster, YLE. And why would you put a drama show on Instagram? Well, by necessity, young viewers become habituated to video on all of the platforms where they are consuming video. And of course, scripted storytelling is happening and should be happening in all of these places. So my point is, let's not get distracted. Let's not get distracted while we're dealing with this immediate crisis. Let's not get distracted if we miraculously bounce back and are sent again into the trenches of the streaming wars. The survival of film is not just about what we can get funded. The world in which the audience lives and their audiovisual landscape, that must guide our way. Historically, we looked at TV drama and we felt that it was irrelevant to feature film storytelling. We didn't need to care about that, and we were wrong. Let's not make the same mistake again. The conceptual landscape of video more broadly is changing around us, and maybe this time, instead of reacting with arrogant superiority, we could ask ourselves what we can learn. Certainly, narrative interactivity is interesting artistically, but that is not relevant to every filmmaker. That's not my point. But to other things that these competing formats and platforms are very good at is relevance, connecting with what the audience actually wants and needs, and at building real relationships with their audience. In our industry, for the past 4 or 5 months, for the first time in a very, very long time, possibly ever, we knew exactly where the audience was. We knew exactly what the audience's concerns were, and we had a pretty good idea of where their attention was directed. Even presented with an impossible situation, such as complete closures of physical cinemas, many cinemas and many festivals during the crisis have found their audience relationships transformed, typically for the better, often entirely re-energized. Festivals suddenly found that they were able to reach audiences that they didn't even know were interested in what they had to offer. And many local cinemas saw passionate support from their local communities, I would guess, even from people who have an identity of themselves as arthouse moviegoers, but who don't actually, for many reasons, end up going out and buying that ticket in a normal year. But they wanted to invest anyway, and they wanted to support. So what caused this new quality in the connection? I think 2 things had happened. For once, people inside the film industry and outside the film industry were sharing the same social experiences and were directly able to imagine each other's situations. And I know that we think that because we are storytellers, literally imagining other people's situations is what we do. But I'm sorry to say, as we know from having a billion projects that haven't connected in the way that we wished, we are not always great at this. But during the crisis, we had a pretty good idea. We were all experiencing similar things. But we in the film industry also really, during the pandemic, we needed to listen, which also, I am sorry to say, we are not historically great at. What we tend to do is we choose things and then we show them to the audience. We haven't needed to listen. But during the pandemic, people, in particular in exhibition, have been forced to ask themselves questions like this. I wonder what movie people out there feel they really need to see right now. And I mean, that's a big existential question in some way, like what movie would be so good for your soul that you will potentially risk your life to go out and see it in a theater. But it could also be, arguably this should be a programming question at all times. What movie do people out there need to see? The answers to that question have actually been very interesting as well. I learned in a seminar this week that for quite a lot of people in Europe in the last month, it's been this movie from 2016, I Am Not Your Negro, based on the writings of James Baldwin. But that's an aside. The important thing is asking that question, which in our industry we almost never do. We ask what films are available for me to program. We ask what stories do we want to tell? What can we get funded? Or abstractly, we might ask which stories deserve to get told. And even that final question, I think, has the wrong perspective. It's not which stories deserve to be told, it's which stories deserve to be heard. And if you ask a question like that, then you are putting the audience at the center. And you might be making the exact same film, but you will need to know who you are addressing. And to find out who needs what we do, and when they need it, we have to listen. In fact, arguably to survive in this content landscape with the endless offerings out there, everyone in the film industry value chain has to have a real listening relationship to the audience. You can listen quantitatively to data, or you can listen qualitatively, for instance, to social media. But if we don't listen, we can't build relationships. This is for two reasons. One, if we don't learn about viewers' lives and values and their concerns, we can't make content that is relevant to them. Two, if we don't learn about their behaviors, we can't place that content accurately. Which actually means that there's a third, I realize, which is if we don't know where their attention is, then we can't monetize that attention. Even when we're telling the exact story that they are needing to hear, we need to know where they are physically and where their attention is to be able to tell, for them to hear it, right? And the story people need to hear is not necessarily the story people want to hear if you ask them. Of course, that's comfort viewing, and as we've learned in the pandemic, that is also very, very important. But needing is what drives a middle-class white 22-year-old in Europe to the cinema in the middle of a pandemic to hear a black intellectual speak. And to know what you should be programming, you need to empathize with what people are experiencing, or you need to listen to them actively. And during the pandemic, this has been easier because so many of us all around the world have been on very similar journeys. But now that we've tried this, we have to take this skill and develop it, and because we know we can see its potential, and we have to develop that as we go forward. And I mean, by the way, the reason we have been bad at listening historically, or bad at building relationship historically, is not just the arrogance of the artist or the dictatorial power of the entertainment giant. It's also that the audience's relationship with the film industry is split up along the value chain. The emotional relationship is with the filmmaker or with the on-screen talent. We are advertised at by the distributors, the physical, the direct relationship in many ways, and the physical experience happens in the context and in relation to the exhibitor. Our largest economic relationship, arguably, is with the now online stores and the services and the cable companies that sell access to digital content. So it has been unclear who actually should be communicating to the audience in what way. And unfortunately, I mean, of course, also many of these steps are consolidating. That is a development that is happening, and that does make this easier. But even if you are working in a unit that is very similar to what would have existed 20 or 30 years ago, this will still be your job. You still need to listen to the audience. The good news is that by now, almost all of our actions generate data, and that means that your audience is speaking to you all the time. Different data is good for different things, but if you look for it, all of it can tell you something. And in particular, we have to pay attention when something happens that makes us surprised. When the projections are wildly off in either direction. But okay, failures can have many reasons, but in particular, when something succeeds beyond your expectations, that is really, really vital information. I said this last year, but it deserves repeating. If you read in the trade papers that a film overperforms in the theaters, it always means that the industry has somehow underestimated the audience. And I cannot believe that we are still astonished every time that an insanely talented black filmmaker who makes a very, very good film will draw a large black audience, let alone a large everybody audience. We have to stop writing stories about how astonishing this is. It's not astonishing. It has been true for a very long time, in fact, always. Overperforms is a weasel word. Usually in life, if you're surprised, the reason you are surprised is that you were basing some expectation on an internalized norm instead of the data right in front of you. So we are going to have to stop doing that. So we're now seeing feature films connect with broader and younger audiences, and obviously the reason this has happened so clearly in the last few years is because more types of stories are getting told. Tell me something true, tell me something I don't know. And I mean, I wish we would all do the right thing just because it's right, but as is suggested by that word overperforms, it is also really good business to do the right thing. Enabling new voices also, in addition, supports our fight for democracy, for the locally and regionally and sociologically specific. It protects our local cultures on one hand and also pierces through and challenges barriers of bias on the other. And on that note, I would like just briefly to remind you of one good thing and one terrible thing before the end. And the first good thing, actually, is to point at how Disney, and specifically the team of Jennifer Lee and Chris Buck, collaborated with a group of indigenous experts on the film Frozen 2 after messing that up pretty badly in Frozen 1. This expert group is known as the Verdet. It was comprised of representatives from several indigenous Sami groups, including the International Sami Film Institute. They actually wrote a literal contract, which you can probably not read on the screen, but this is a ceremonial version of the contract. And if you read it closely, you can find it online. You will see this contract signed by a major corporation defining the Sami traditions and arts as the property of the Sami nation. If Disney can get this right after a very long history of getting it wrong, then so can all of us. And I mention this example because diversity and representation, even on this very high level of global justice towards the indigenous peoples on whose unceded lands we all live and whose ways of life we have ruined, you know, this is, it can sound abstract to some of you, but this is not a niche concern. It's the right thing to do, to care about this, but also increasingly, politically, it is a market necessity to such a degree that even Disney can work here on this. So if the moral universe is bending capital towards justice, we can all do better. In fact, we must do better. And then one reason why we must do better, of course, is this. I don't know if you've had time during the Marché to read the mainstream news. If you had, you would hear a great deal about this heat wave, and especially what it is predicted, the havoc it is predicted to cause in Siberia. You are all educated people. I don't need to tell you that we are in deep trouble. We have broken the systems that all of the systems that we rely on. We cannot make this right. If we manage to survive as a civilization, let alone as a species, we will do so by doing almost everything right in the next 10 years. And even if we do, it will still take centuries or possibly 1,000 years for the climate to entirely stabilize. So in our lifetime, certainly on the longer scale, and certainly in the lifetimes of our children, things will get worse before they get better. In the 2019 and 2018 Nostradamus reports, which you can find on the site, I wrote a lot about fascism and about climate change. Fascism is obviously a threat to democracy, to all minorities, and in the end, to all artists and to all intellectuals. But populist and authoritarian leaders are also just an immediate threat to public arts funding, which of course pretty much all filmmaking relies on here in Europe. They are also a threat against science-based policy, which is an urgent and alarming problem because science-based policy is necessary for the survival of our civilization. And also, climate change, obviously, the climate crisis is a threat to the survival of the economic system that produces a stable global middle class, and those people are our audience. Literally every decision we make every day should be weighed in the context of these two macro trends. And the next 2 years, 3 years will be particularly vital because millions, I'm thinking probably hundreds of millions of people, as we speak, are slipping from that global middle class towards poverty because of this recession that is following from the pandemic. These people are our audience, but more importantly, when the middle classes take big financial hits, historically what tends to happen is the populists are strengthened, polarization increases, and the destructive loop can continue. And in fact, just today, this morning, I heard on the news that hundreds of statesmen from all over the world have put out a letter expressing concern with how authoritarian leaders are exploiting the pandemic to take on even bigger power. We cannot pretend that none of this is happening. Even if you were in complete denial, I think all of us are experiencing the extreme weather events around us. So this is where I'm going to end. The Nostradamus Project is in its 7th year, and for 7 years I have spoken about change, often in the context of threats, right? But even in this dark time that we now live in, arguably much darker than it was even just half a year ago, I would like from now on to be speaking about change through the lens of lessons and possibilities. At the start of the year, I marveled at how a Korean film about colonialism and social inequality can become a commercial success in the United States. I marveled that a Swedish film like this one about dance can change sexual politics, or at least challenge sexual politics in the country of Georgia. And if this pandemic has taught us anything, it was that those things, impressive at the time, but they were small miracles, tiny miracles. The space of possibility has grown infinitely in the last several months. All of us now have some idea, some images in our minds about what does a global disaster actually look like. And I'm sorry to say that this, by the way, was our practice pandemic. This was the easy pandemic. It doesn't hit our children. So the next one might not be so easy, and there will be a next one. And before the next one comes, probably there will be other disasters. That's just the way it's going to be right now. But we have also seen what is possible, and those things were unthinkable in January. We know now that we can act coherently on a national and global level at a scale that was completely unimaginable just a few months ago. We know that you might suddenly be buying groceries for an elderly person that you don't even know, because that's just the way we live now. I felt that was pretty unexpected. We have learned that even the window system is not sacred when the stakes are high enough. We are allowed to think in new ways. We are allowed to innovate, even in a very traditional industry such as ours. And when storytelling restarts, it will restart in a moment when it is needed more than ever. And I think that all of us found out in lockdown that there are many things in our lives that we don't actually need. But this industry is needed. And that is a responsibility as well as a gift. The link to download the report is here. It's göteborgfilmfestival.se/Nostradamus. We will also link there to recordings of this seminar, and of course all the information about the Göteborg Film Festival and about the Nordic film market you can find on the website as well. I would like again to say a thank you to our supporters, without whom today would not be possible. I would like to thank you for your attention. I'll see if I have a possibility to answer questions later on. Otherwise, my email address is right here. Thank you to Sten in Paris. Thank you for the team of Next and the Marché. See you in Cannes. Bye.